Hello students, today we are going to talk about diagramming complex sentences. We've already discussed what a complex sentence is. It is made up of two clauses, an independent clause and a dependent clause. And so we're going to talk about diagramming them today. They're very similar to diagramming compound sentences with a slightly different structure to the line. So we still are going to identify the two separate clauses, diagram those clauses independently of each other, and then we will connect them together. But we're going to work through these couple sentences that I sent you a note sheet for. If you were able to print them out, follow along with me, mark them up just as I mark them up on the board so that you get that practice in identifying the different clauses and the types of clauses. If you can't print them off, just make sure you're paying attention really well, and you'll have an opportunity to do it to some sentences later. But our first sentence is, Max tormented the Norwegian factory workers when his father controlled the factory for the Germans in Norway. So first, just like we have been doing on Fix-It Grammar, we're going to go through and identify our prepositional phrases. So Max tormented the Norwegian factory workers when his father controlled the factory for the Germans. For is a preposition. So for the Germans is a prepositional phrase. We're going to underline that. And in Norway is also a prepositional phrase, and so we're going to underline that as well. Now we're going to look for verbs. Max tormented. Tormented is an action verb, and so he is doing something, so it's an action. The Norwegian factory workers, when his father controlled, controlled again is an action verb. He is doing something. So controlled the factory for the Germans in Norway. Just two verbs here. Now let's find the subjects that go with those verbs. Who tormented? Max tormented. Subject. Who controlled? Father controlled. Subject. We have no compound subjects or compound verbs in this sentence. Okay, so the next thing that we do with Fix-It is we go and look for our phrases. Remember, a phrase is made up of a subject and a verb and all the words that modify that subject and verb. So Max tormented the Norwegian factory workers. That's our first phrase. It's our subject and a verb, Max tormented. Tormented who? Workers is our direct object there. So then the question is this an independent, I'm sorry, I've been saying phrases. I should be saying clauses. Clauses are made up of subjects and verbs and all of their modifiers. So this is our first clause in our sentence. We can have an independent clause or a dependent clause. So is this independent, meaning it could be a complete sentence all by itself? Or is it dependent, meaning it needs more information to make it a complete thought? Max tormented the Norwegian factory workers. That's a complete thought, right? We could leave that, we could put a period right there, and it would be a complete sentence, a total thought. It makes complete sense. So we're going to put it in brackets. Max tormented the Norwegian factory workers. All right, our next subject verb, his father. So we're looking for our next clause made up of a subject and verb. When his father controlled the factory for the Germans in Norway. Is that a complete thought? When his father controlled the factory for the Germans in Norway. That's not a complete thought. We want to know what happens when his father did this. Or what about when his father controlled it? So that's a dependent clause. We can't just put a period and a capital letter and call it a complete sentence. It doesn't make full sense. So that one we're going to put in parentheses to mark it as dependent. Okay, so now we have a complex sentence because we have an independent clause followed by a dependent clause. We need to decide if we need punctuation. Remember, if our independent clause comes first and is followed by a dependent clause, do you remember if we need a comma? We don't need a comma. We can leave it just like this. Independent clause followed by dependent clause. There's no comma to connect them. Okay, so that's how we're going to analyze the sentence just like we do for Fix-It. We mark our subjects, our verbs, our independent clauses and dependent clauses, and then we can be ready to diagram. So when you're diagramming complex sentences, the first thing you do is you always diagram the independent clause first. Even if the dependent clause comes first in the sentence, The independent clause is the main thought of that sentence, and so it's going to be the top of our diagram. We diagram it first. So Max tormented the Norwegian factory workers. Can you identify what pattern this is? Max tormented, subject, verb. Tormented what? Workers. Verbed what? Workers. Does workers mean the same thing as Max? Do we have a linking verb here? No, it doesn't. So workers is going to be our direct object. And we don't have an indirect object, and so this is a pattern 2 sentence. So let's draw our pattern 2 sentence down here. Max, subject, tormented, verb, tormented what or tormented whom? Workers. All right, so there's our main nouns and verbs of the sentence. And now we need to go fill in our modifiers. What kind of workers? Factory workers. What kind of workers? Norwegian workers. The workers, article, adjective. So the, Norwegian, and factory are all adjectives because they're all describing workers. Now when we move on to our dependent clause, it begins with the subordinating conjunction when. We're going to ignore that for the moment. Just set it aside, ignore it. It's what connects it, just like our coordinating conjunctions connect. It connects it, so we'll do that last. So his father controlled what? Controlled factory. Direct object. Again, we simply have a pattern 2 sentence. So let's put that underneath. Father is our subject. Verb is controlled. Our line, our direct object line is straight up and down and just goes right to our main line. Controlled what? Factory. All right, so those are all of our main, those are our main words for our sentence. Now let's go back and check our modifiers. His answers the question whose father or which father? His father, so it is an adjective. It's a possessive pronoun adjective. Which factory? The factory. For the Germans. Now here's what we have to ask the question. Is it a factory for the Germans? Well, actually, no, it wasn't. It was the Norwegian factory. So we then need to find out, what does for the Germans describe, or what does it modify? It modifies controlled. Who did he control it for? For the Germans. So it's going to go underneath here. For is our preposition. For whom? Germans. Object of the preposition. The article, adjective. In Norway. Now, here's where we can disagree, and that's okay. Again, what does in Norway describe? Well, is it a factory in Norway? Yeah, it is. You can put it under factory. Which factory? The factory in Norway. You could also answer the question, controlled where? Controlled in Norway. So it could hang off of controlled. Sometimes prepositional phrases can hang off of more than one spot, depending on the way that you understand the sentence. So I'm going to hang it off of factory because it just seems to be easiest there and make sense. Which factory? The factory in Norway. But if you wanted to hang it off of controlled, if that makes more sense to you, that would be just fine. In Norway. Okay, so we've now diagrammed every single thing up here except for our subordinating conjunction when. Now remember, when we have a coordinating conjunction, we do a dashed line with a step in the middle and a dashed line down, and you write the coordinating conjunction on that step. A subordinating conjunction is really similar to that, except we just do a straight dashed line. And again, it's connecting our two verbs. So it's just a straight vertical dashed line. And if it's going to run into your verb, that's just fine. It doesn't have to touch the main line of your sentence. But connect it there, and then we write sideways on here. when. So now we know this is our independent clause followed by our dependent clause. Now if we were to just see this diagram, we could read it, we could create a sentence either way. We could either say, when his father controlled the factory in Norway for the Germans, Max tormented the Norwegian factory workers. We could read it that way, and that would be just fine. Or we can read it the way it's written. This is one of those places where you don't necessarily know the exact original sentence from the diagram, but it's very clear what's meant because we have our independent clause followed by our dependent clause. All right, I'm going to pause the video and write the next sentence up here because you don't need to watch me write the next sentence. It was like magic. It just suddenly appeared up here. Okay, so we have our new sentence. It's sentence number 2 on your worksheets. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go through the fix-it grammar process with it, identifying its subject and verb, identifying the prepositional phrases, and then identifying the clauses and what types of clauses they are so that we know how to punctuate it. Okay, so let's find our prepositional phrases first. Because Max was a little terror, the Norwegian boys kidnapped him and took him to England. To is a prepositional phrase. Where? England, object of the preposition. With them. With preposition. With whom? Them, object of the preposition. So we have our 2 prepositional phrases there. Now we're going to go back and look for verbs. Remember, verbs can be action verbs where there's something happening, they're doing something, or they can be linking or state of being verbs. Okay, so here we have a state of being verb. And those are all, those linking verbs are in your grammar jingles. So make sure that you know those. You have to just be able to recognize those right away. So go back to your jingles if you need to and do it a couple times, the linking verb jingle, so that you can just recognize them. Because Max was here is being a linking verb. We're going to go ahead and call it linking verb to remind us later on that it is a linking verb. Was a little terror. The Norwegian boys kidnapped. Now that's an action. They're doing something. They're taking him. So kidnapped, verb, him, and took. It's another action verb. Verb, him to England with them. Okay, now let's go find our subjects for these verbs. Was, who was, Max was, subject. Now we're going to look over here. Kidnapped, who kidnapped, boys, subject, kidnapped. Then we're going to go down to took. Who took? Well, the same boys took. So we have a compound verb and a compound verb here. Thought we could do a little bit of review on compound verbs while we're at this. So I made sure to include one of those today. All right, so we have the boys kidnapped and the boys took. There's one subject, but 2 verbs with it. Okay, now we're going to keep running into my board. Now we're going to look for clauses. Clauses include a subject and a verb and all of the modifiers. Okay, so because Max was a little terror, that's the first thought in the sentence. Is it a complete thought? Could that be a sentence all by itself? Because Max was a little terror? No, that can't be a complete sentence all by itself. Even though students often like to write answers to questions beginning with because and just one clause, it's actually not a complete thought. We have to finish it. What about the fact that Max was a little terror? So that is a dependent clause. So we're going to put it in parentheses. Dependent clause. Now let's find our next clause. The Norwegian boys kidnapped him and took him to England with them. So there's our next clause. Is that a complete thought? The Norwegian boys kidnapped him and took him to England with them. Yes, that is. From this clause alone, we don't necessarily know who the him is, but it's still a complete thought. It makes complete sense. So that is an independent clause. All right, now we need to go back and check for punctuation. We have a dependent clause followed by an independent clause in the same sentence. So we know it's a complex sentence because it has a dependent clause and it has an independent clause. But the dependent clause came first. So does that mean we need a comma? Think about it. You can even listen and hear it. Because Max was a little terror, the Norwegian boys, we need that comma. We need that pause. Oh, so what's going to happen because Max was a little terror, right? So we are going to put the comma between our two clauses. The dependent clause came first, followed by an independent clause, and so it requires a comma in there. All right, now we get to diagram it. Remember, do we start with the very first clause in the sentence as our first diagram? No, we always start with the independent clause because that's the main thought of the sentence. So we're going to go to this independent clause first. The Norwegian boys kidnapped him and took him to England with them. Can you identify what pattern this is? The Norwegian boys kidnapped him and took him to England with them. Boys kidnapped whom? Him. Direct object. Boys took whom? Him. Direct object. So yes, this is a pattern 2 sentence and it has a compound verb in it. So we're going to go ahead and diagram this. In our subject spot, we have boys. We draw our subject line. And then we need to draw our prongs for our compound verb. So one goes up that way and out like that. And the other prong comes down here and out like that. So we have this little pronged or sideways house, if you will. Then we add our dashed line in. Right? Our dashed line for and always goes up here. And the first verb is kidnapped. Kidnapped. And then we include our direct object with it. Kidnapped whom? Him. Our second verb is took. Took. Took whom? Him. So there we just have our compound verb. If we had a compound subject, we'd have prongs on this side going the opposite direction. But this one we don't. We just have a compound verb. All right. So let's go back now and do our modifiers. The article adjective. What kind of boys? Norwegian. Boys. We have our subject verb line. Kidnapped him and took him. Took him where? To prepositional phrase. England. Right? It's to England. It can't describe him. It's not a to England him. That's really awkward. It's a took. Took where? Took to England. And then we could ask took how? With them. Because again, it's not a with them him. That's awkward. It is a took how with them. With them and to England. Okay, so that is our first and our only independent clause in this sentence. So underneath it, now we're going to diagram our dependent clause. And again, we're going to look here and see what pattern are we diagramming. Max was, unless it's being used as a helping verb, is a linking verb. So when we have a linking verb, we need to check it, what follows it, and we're looking either for a predicate adjective or a predicate noun. Max was what? Terror. Terror, it can be used as an adjective, but here it's being used as a noun, and we know that because we have an A in front of it. So Max was what? Terror is a predicate noun. So then let's go down to our diagram. Our subject always goes in that same spot. Max, followed by its verb, was. Then when we have a predicate, when we have a linking verb followed by a predicate noun or predicate adjective, do you remember what kind of line we use? Slanted. Because whatever goes here is pointing us back to our subject. And so it's slanted, this direction to point us back. Was what? Was terror. All right, what kind of terror? Little, adjective, a article adjective. And that is everything in there except for our because. So then our because we're still connecting a complex sentence. So we're going to, again, use our dashed line between our verbs. Dash line between our verbs with a because. And we capitalize because here. Actually, I take back what I said earlier. This is how we know what order it came in. Because is capitalized, so we know it has to come first. Whereas previously when we wrote when, we didn't capitalize it, so it didn't come first in the sentence. But because is capitalized, so therefore it comes first in the sentence. So that's how we diagram complex sentences. We have a straight dashed line in between it, and otherwise we just diagram our clauses as their individual patterns. So we'll continue to practice with that after spring break, but I won't see you again for grammar until after spring break. So have a great break.